Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. I wanted to talk about the Child's Play movies and the crimes that they supposedly inspired. These films have always held a bit of a strange fascination for me. I was born in the early 80s, and by the time I was 10 years old, there were two horrific murders hitting the headlines and being linked to the Child's Play movies. One of these murders was committed by two boys who were around the same age as me, so naturally I was intrigued. I remember reading lurid articles about the brainwashing influence of the killer Chucky doll, and as I hadn't seen these movies myself, I was left to imagine what kind of scenes could be in a film so horrific that they would drive people to murder. To understand this era and the media hype surrounding these films, you have to go back to the early 80s and the moral panic of the video nasties. Actually, let's go back even further to the 60s and look at the Bobo doll experiments. Between 1961 and 1963, there were a series of experiments carried out at Stanford University. They tested whether children observing aggressive behaviour would then become more aggressive themselves. In the experiments, children were made to observe an adult, either in the flesh or on a TV screen, interacting with Bobo, an inflatable clown doll. There was 3 groups of children. One was a control group. One group observed the adult interacting pleasantly with the Bobo doll, and the other group watched an adult punching, kicking, and verbally abusing the clown. Surprise, surprise, when left alone with the doll afterwards, the children that had observed the aggressive behaviour acted much more aggressively towards Bobo themselves. The results of these experiments have since been used to argue that depictions of violence in media lead to an increase in violence in the real world. Personally, I think it only proves that some children in a laboratory environment will beat up a clown doll because they just saw someone else doing it. Possibly they might even think that it's part of the experiment to copy what they just saw. Real life violence carries many more consequences than hitting an inflatable clown doll. Despite the flaws in the experiments, the idea that on-screen violence causes real-world violence took hold. Now jump forward to the 80s, where a sudden rise in violent crime was being blamed on the evil influence of video nasties. The early 80s was quite a revolutionary time for movie fans, and VHS technology had become cheap enough for a lot of households to have their own video recorder, so for the first time in history the majority of people had some way of recording movies from the TV, as well as renting and buying movies from the video store. There was also something strange about the certification of videos in the early 80s. To get a cinema release in the UK, films had to go through the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification. Often graphic scenes of violence or sex would be cut by the board before it was approved for release, and it was given an age rating so that people under a certain age wouldn't be able to see movies that were deemed unsuitable. When VHS came along, there was a loophole in the law. Films could be released straight to video without going through the BBFC, which led to a short-lived sort of Wild West of unrated movies being released completely uncut on VHS with no age ratings. This caused a media-fueled moral panic, and a list of so-called video nasties was drawn up, a selection of films deemed so horrific that they would destroy the very moral fabric of society if something wasn't done. In 1984, the Video Recordings Act was brought in to ensure that any video available for sale or rental in the UK had to carry a classification from the BBFC. Still, this new law didn't stop the media frenzy around horror movies and calls for increasing censorship. The main drive of this censorship campaign was the supposed effect these horror movies had on children. And whilst I agree it's probably not a good idea to let kids watch a film made for adults, surely that decision is up to the child's parents. Instead, the newspapers called for these films to be banned outright. As is the case with all moral busybodies, their own particular version of morality had to be imposed on the whole of society rather than just letting adults make decisions for themselves. When left unchecked, this coddling mindset is why we now have to have a warning on a Penguin documentary that it contains mild peril. Anyway, this rather long preamble is just to set the scene a little. Horror movies back then always felt a little bit illicit, like there could be things on those tapes that you weren't supposed to see. And it was against this cultural backdrop that the killing of Suzanne Capper and of Jamie Bulger hit the headlines, and quickly the press tried to blame the Child's Play movies for influencing these crimes. In 1992, a 16-year-old girl named Suzanne Capper was lured to a friend's house. She was then tied to a bed frame and tortured by 6 other people over the course of 7 days. I've covered this case in another video if you want a bit more of an in-depth look at it. The details are pretty gruesome. She was burned with cigarettes, injected with amphetamines, she had her skin scrubbed off and her teeth pulled out. On the final day, they took her out into a field and set her on fire. She later died in hospital, but not before naming her attackers. One of the most bizarre details about the case is that one of the torturers, Bernadette McNeely, started to use the phrase "Chucky wants to play" at the start of each torture session. Fueled by a cocktail of drugs and becoming increasingly depraved, even the other people involved in the torture began to be disturbed by McNeely's behaviour as she started to assume the character of the murderous doll. Another disturbing detail is that they would put headphones over Suzanne's ears and blast the same rave track over and over again. This track was titled "Hi, I'm Chucky, Wanna Play" by 150 Volts, and it features that line repeated throughout the song. I'm Chucky, wanna play. Of course, the media seized on these details as the corrupting influence of the Child's Play movies, but was that actually the case? Would Suzanne Capper still be alive if the Child's Play movies didn't exist? Detective Inspector Peter Wall, who led the inquiry into the murder, said that throughout interviews with the accused, there is no suggestion that the reason Suzanne was killed had anything to do with Child's Play. The initial motive for the kidnapping was a dispute about a missing coat and the accusation that Suzanne Capper had given somebody pubic lace. It seems to have escalated from there. Undoubtedly, Bernadette McNeely in her drug-addled state had begun to draw some inspiration from Chucky as a character, but if those movies didn't exist, it could easily have been some other fictional monster. One overlooked fact about that case is that in Bernadette's house they found a collection of horror novels including Misery by Stephen King. It's a story about a man being tied to a bed and tortured, and yet the media didn't try to blame King or call for his books to be banned. And just as the Suzanne Capper murder hit the headlines, there was another murder which completely overshadowed the case. 2 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, kidnapped 2-year-old Jamie Bulger and tortured him for several hours before battering him to death and leaving his body on some railway tracks to be run over. During the trial, it was revealed that the last film that John Venables' father had rented was Child's Play 3. And how the media jumped all over that. Ever since the release of the first Child's Play movie, there had been protests and calls for the franchise to be banned because they said it would incite violence in children, and now they had their proof. 2 murders in a row, and all of a sudden, journalists were poring over details of Jamie Bulger's murder and comparing them to the movie to prove that the boys were actually acting out scenes from the film. The boys had stolen a pot of blue Humbrol paint and thrown it into Jamie Bulger's eyes. Wasn't that the same as when Chucky got splattered with blue paintball paint in the film? Well, not really, and the blue paint is such an insignificant part of the film that it wouldn't really make sense that Venables and Thompson would pick that scene to recreate. Well, what about the fact that they'd laid him on the train tracks? Isn't that the same as when the kid gets nearly hit by a roller coaster at the end of the film? Again, not really. What about the fact that they disfigured Jamie's face by smashing it with a rock? Isn't that just like when Chucky gets his face sliced in half by a scythe? Once again, not really, but why let facts get in the way when you've got a narrative to peddle? If they really were recreating scenes from the movie, there are much more significant moments that they could have acted out. Plus, there wasn't any real evidence that the boys had even watched the movie. John Venable's father had denied that they'd seen it, and the boys never expressed any knowledge of the movie when they were questioned by psychologists and police. Still, the papers had to get their headlines, and so the Bulger case and the Child's Play movies have been linked in people's minds ever since. After these details came out, Sky TV stopped a planned airing of Child's Play 3, and many video rental stores pulled it from their shelves. I don't think this was because they thought that the film had actually caused those boys to kill, but because it would seem in bad taste to profit from the film with all the media attention it was getting. That being said, I'm not against the idea that films like Child's Play 3 could have some sort of psychological effect on young children. And here's a memory from around that time, probably before the Bulger murder even happened. I had a friend whose mother actually did let him watch these kinds of movies. I know because he would describe the death scenes in detail, and years later when I actually watched these films for myself, it turned out he was telling the truth. Anyway, he told me that after he'd watched the Child's Play movies, he'd got so scared that he couldn't sleep for days. In order to get over his fear, he stood on his bed in the middle of the night and closed his eyes and shouted out, "Okay Chucky, come and kill me," over and over again until the fear subsided. Obviously these films did have some sort of negative impact on his young mind, but could Chucky actually drive children to violence?
What if the doll somehow affects another child in a negative way?
16 years later, there was another case with a chilling resemblance to the Bulger murder, and again it was linked to the Child's Play movies. In April of 2009, two brothers aged 10 and 11 were riding their bikes near a playground in Edlington, North Yorkshire. They coaxed two other boys aged 9 and 11 away from the park and into a secluded area of waste ground. They then subjected these boys to a 90-minute torture session. The list of abuses is disturbing to read. Among other things, they tried to cut their throats with broken glass. They tried to strangle them with a clothesline, forced branches down their throats, forced them to perform sex acts and urinate on each other, made them eat stinging nettles and dirt. They cut one of the boys' arms open and put a lit cigarette into the wound, and they beat them bloody with sticks and rocks and then dropped a ceramic sink on their heads. Thankfully, both victims survived, mostly because their attackers got too tired to continue the assault. The two brothers, when questioned, were unable to give any reason for why they had carried out the attack other than because they were bored and there was nothing else to do. So what happened in these boys' lives to make them capable of such acts of brutality? Was it the toxic home environments? According to some accounts, the boys' father was a violent alcoholic, and they regularly witnessed their mother being subjected to physical and sexual abuse as well as being abused themselves. Did drug abuse play a role? Apparently, at least one of the brothers had been smoking cannabis and drinking cider since the age of 9, and the mother would lace her children's food to get them to go to bed. Were social services to blame? Had they not done enough to intervene in the weeks leading up to the attack when the brothers had become increasingly violent towards other children? Of course, some papers had found a much more simple answer: horror films. During the trial, a relative of the boys told newspapers that the children had been allowed to watch Saw and Child's Play movies. And once again, certain newspapers who, for some reason, had a particular agenda against Chucky, had another violent crime to pin on their favourite scapegoats. Was there any evidence that these films played any part in the boys' decision to attack those children? Not really. In fact, apart from one relative's statements, I can't find any other mention of the Child's Play films in any part of the police investigation or the trial. It seems to be an extremely minor detail that's been hyped up by journalists. What sells a paper more than if you can put a scary picture of Chucky on the cover and somehow link it to another violent crime? I'm not even sure why they were so obsessed with the Child's Play movies. Is there some special ingredient in these movies that can drive people to commit acts of violence in a way other movies don't? I suppose the link between a killer toy and the effect it might have on children kinda makes sense, but my suspicion is there's nothing in the Child's Play movies that's any different to most other horror movies of that era, and I wouldn't say any of these cases prove otherwise. I think it is true that someone with a sadistic streak might be drawn to violent media, be it comic books or films or video games, but it's another thing entirely to say that this media somehow increases the likelihood of this kind of violence to happen. There have been studies that show that the frequency of on-screen violence doesn't really correspond with a rise in real-world violence. That is, unless you cherry-pick a very specific time period and ignore everything else either side of it. But even if movie violence did relate to a rise in violence in real life, who's to say which one causes the other? If our world becomes increasingly violent, wouldn't our media reflect that by becoming more violent itself? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Personally, I don't think the evidence is there, at least not enough to say that we need to ban or censor these things, and especially not to ban a few dark comedies about a killer doll. Perhaps you feel differently, and I'm always happy to hear other points of view. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you think. I just wanted to talk about this because it's an era that I really remember well, and at that time in my life, my parents were very strict and really made sure that I didn't see any horror movies, and I think possibly this is what got me interested in horror. The media hype and the fact that I was forbidden from watching it made it seem a bit more exciting. And I remember going into video stores, and then when my dad's back was turned, sort of looking at the covers on all these horror movies and trying to imagine what was going on in the films from the little pictures on the back of the case. No wonder as soon as I got a bit older I got completely obsessed with horror movies, and I've loved horror movies ever since, and so far I've not killed anyone. Anyway, thank you to everyone who is supporting the channel. Now, I have got some bad news. I kinda messed up a bit here. I've been doing these prize draws at the end of my last few videos, and apparently it's against Patreon's rules to do prize draws. I didn't realise until I got a warning off Patreon. Now, I looked through the rules and it does say that prize draws are allowed if you open them up to people outside of Patreon, which is what I've been doing. Anyone who supports the channel gets entered even if they're not patrons, but I'm not sure if this is against the rules or not. I think I'll probably have to pack in the prize draws and try and think of something else. If you signed up to Patreon specifically for the prize draws, then don't renew it next month because there won't be any more. As a consolation, I'm going to do one final draw. I'm going to pick 10 random people from everyone who has supported the channel this month. Patrons are included, but it's not technically a Patreon draw, and it's the last one I'm going to do, so don't ban me please. I've only got 4 of these keyrings left, so the first 4 names will get keyrings and stickers and a drawing. The last 6 will get exactly the same, except they'll get a fridge magnet instead of a keyring. Yes, wow, I know, amazing prizes. It's so sad that they're going away. Anyway, on with the final prize draw. Hello everybody, welcome to the final prize draw. First 4 people, those winning a keyring, are Mistress Calitix, Shannon Dubs, Alice Blue, and 8 Deer. Congratulations, 6 people winning the amazing magnets. Mike Keith, nice. Mason Day, congratulations. Muscle Rack, Lauren, Kieran Bilgeiner, I'm sorry if I said your name wrong there, and Giggles. Alright then, there we go, there's our winners. If you are a patron, then check your patron inbox, I'll message you on there. If you are a supporter some other way, then check your email, I will email you there. Okay, congratulations to your winners. I apologise that that's the last one. I just didn't realise patrons' rules on these things before I started this whole endeavour. Alright, thank you everybody for watching. I hope you found this video interesting, and I'll see you in the next video.